Our next session, we're going to pivot from technology and innovation to politics and international relations. And to do that, I want to introduce our next moderator, who's Jean Ooi. Jean is the William Haas Professor of Chinese Politics in the Department of Political Science at Stanford, and she's also a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, also at Stanford. Her research and teaching have focused on political economy and the process of reform in transitional systems. And Jean has been a very important leader for Stanford in our ongoing engagement with China. She directs the China program at the Walter Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, and she's also the Li Xiaoqi director of the Stanford Center at Peking University. And she was instrumental in getting that center off the ground at PKU and in continuing to run it and keeping our activities going here in Beijing. And she's also been instrumental in this event as well. So Jean, I'll turn it over to you to lead this next session.
Thank you very much, John. We now turn to one of the most important topics that I think will affect all of the other issues that we have talked about today, and that is U.S. and China. Now, I don't think I need to spend time going through why that's an important topic. I think that what we want to do today is to talk about what may happen to this relationship, because this relationship currently is being tested. Just today, President Trump just threatened another $267 billion worth of new tariffs on Chinese goods, so that this trade friction, I think, is turning into a clearly a trade war. So what we want to do for this session is to ask the question of how did we get to this point? What is likely to happen? What can or what should we do to try to ensure that there is what Eric Schmidt talked about as entanglement, as opposed to pushing apart and dividing? And so these are the issues that I think some of the key issues that we need to talk about. And to address this, we have two of the leading experts on China. And one economist and one political scientist. And both of them have gone beyond being academics and have served important roles in higher education as well as in government. We're going to start out with Lawrence Lau, who is my former colleague at Stanford, when he was the K.T. Lee Professor in Economic Development. But then he left us to become the Vice Chancellor at Chinese University of Hong Kong, where he also holds the Ralph and Claire Landau Professor of Economy. And he has a number of awards. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society, an academician of the Academia Sinica, as well as an overseas fellow of Churchill. And in 2009, he was also named a non-official member of the Executive Council of Hong Kong. So Larry will first give a presentation, and then that will be followed by Susan Shirk, fellow political scientist, one of the leading political scientists on China, both on political economy as well as on Chinese security and foreign policy. She is the chair of the 21st Century China Center at the University of California, San Diego. She is the director emeritus of the University of California's Institute of Global Conflict and Cooperation. She also was the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under the Clinton administration, in charge of the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs. And currently, she's engaged in a very important She heads a task force called the U.S. Policy Towards China Recommendations for a New Administration. And so our procedure is going to differ slightly from past panels. We'll have the two presenters make short presentations, and then we'll engage in a discussion. So please welcome Larry Lau.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased and honored to be here. I actually am a Stanford graduate, class of 1964, and I actually taught at Stanford for more than 40 years before going back to Hong Kong. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I love Stanford. Today, I prepare a PowerPoint, and basically just to stimulate discussion, just to sort of lay the background so people can ask questions. I'll just go through this very quickly because I have exactly 15 minutes. I think everybody understands that the U.S. China Relations is the most important bilateral relation in the world today. And they are both the largest and the second largest economy in the world, the largest and the second largest trading country in the world. And they are each other's largest trading partner. So you can see it's actually very important. If China and the US work together, many things are possible. Okay, one example is the Paris Agreement 2015 on climate change. And that's only possible because President Obama and President Xi, they work very hard together to make it possible. I think the other things are possible, for example, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which everyone wants to happen. And I think that is something that, if the US and China work together, it actually has some chance of being succeeding. But I think it's really also far too early for us to talk about G2. It's very dangerous to talk about G2. I urge you not to talk about a G2. I just want to start with a little history. The United States actually was probably China's best friend in the 19th and 20th century. It was the only country that did not have a lease, a colony, a concession in a sphere of influence in China. And even though it was part of the Eight-Nation Alliance, the Boxer Rebellion, I think that the United States actually returned a substantial part of the Boxer indemnity, which actually resulted in part in the founding of the Tsinghua University. Today was from the return Boxer indemnity. Then I think there's some hard patches like the Korean War and so forth. And actually during the Sino-Japanese War, there were the volunteers, Flying Tigers volunteer, which American volunteers came and helped China. So it's actually had a very good experience until the Korean War. And the Korean War and the Vietnam War, both China and US were on opposite sides. Okay, that's quite clear. But since 1971, I guess the Kissinger and then Nixon's visit, and also in 1978, the US and China reestablished relationship, I think again, it actually has been a very good stretch. In fact, it is basically under US tutelage that China began to open up and to participate in the world economy. And the results, what we have today. I think that without the reform and opening up and actually joining the WTO, I don't think China would be half as prosperous as it is today. And so anyway, I think that's very important. But the economic growth of China has actually been extremely rapid. Okay, in the last 40 years, let me see if I could advance this. This is an example, a chart of what happened in the past, and what happened was what I projected would happen in the future. But you can see the red columns. The red columns are higher than the blue columns. These are the annual rates of growth of the Chinese economy, and you could actually see that China has been actually growing every year since 1978, every single year. There's not a single year with negative growth rate. The lowest year was 3.9%. Okay, but even then it would take a long time to catch up And my prediction is that around early 2030s, that the Chinese total GDP will probably overtake the US GDP. But in terms per capita, you can see that it's still a huge gap, even at 2035. You know, 20 people, and even though you can see all the red columns signifying that the Chinese per capita GDP has been growing so much faster than the US GDP, but you know, it's still very low. My personal thinking is that it would take to the end of this century before Chinese per capita GDP would reach the level of US per capita GDP. I won't see it, but anyway. But I think one of the things that we also have to take into account is the fact that competition between number one and number two is inevitable. Okay, I mean, we hope this is a friendly competition, but you know, if you're number one, number two is coming up quickly behind you. I mean, the first thought you have would be that how can we slow this person down, right? I mean, you know, I think that's a very natural thinking, and we really have to accept it. But competition actually can be both positive and negative, all right? And you know, in some sense, you can think of that the U.S. success today in technology and is partly stimulated by the Sputnik in 1957. Okay, that's a wake-up call. And the U.S. since then invested a great deal in basic research, in technology, and you know, it's now quite, you know, at the top, still way ahead of the pack. One of the things I want to mention is this: that many computer scientists here, you know that this year the fastest computer in the world is the IBM Summit. Okay, it's an American supercomputer. 2017 and 2016. They were a Chinese supercomputer called Sunway Taihu Light. Okay, you know, finally flipped back to U.S. leadership, and every one of them was faster than the last one. So I think competition actually is not bad. We hope that China and the U.S. will not compete in the number of warheads, but would compete to see who can find a cure for the Alzheimer's disease or cancer, to be the first to find, and that would be good for the mankind. Talk a little bit about major power relations. You probably all have heard, if you've not read Graham Allison's book on the Thucydides trap. Basically, he said that, you know, that a war might be inevitable between the U.S. and China. I personally don't believe it, but my thinking is really the following: whether China and the U.S. would become friend or foe, really is a self-fulfilling expectation. If both countries think that they will be friends forever, they will turn out to be friends, and accordingly, they will turn out to be friends. If they think they're going to be foes, eventually, they will, in fact, turn out to be foes, because they will act according to their expectations. So it is really very careful for leaders on both sides to try to manage the expectations. You really can, and once they can be self-fulfilling. Once you get out of hand, it's very difficult. So I actually am very much supportive of what Eric Schmidt said at lunch, that, you know, this is something that we really have to work on. The other thing I want to say is this: I'm very happy that Eric Schmidt mentioned near peer. Okay, one of the things that I observe is the following: historically, China has never had a friend that it would treat as an equal. Okay, when it's strong, everybody under the sun is a vassal state. Okay, when it's weak, every Western power, they were subservient to every Western power. So it really doesn't know how to have a friend that is equal. Same as the US. If you think about US, doesn't treat the UK as equal, save it several times. France, occupied Germany, Italy, and Japan, and none of them, North and South America, no. So nobody in the US mind would be an equal, except for the former Soviet Union, maybe Russia today, but these are adversaries. They are not friends. So I think both countries really have to learn how to treat each other as a friend, as an equal, as a peer, not just a near peer. Near peer is not good enough. It has to be a peer on both sides and respect each other. So I think that is really something that we need to work on. Now let me talk a little bit about the current trade war. President Trump just announced the latest tariff on the total now is probably 517 billion, whatever it is, of goods. But that is actually, China cannot retaliate because that is almost a sum total of the Chinese export to U.S. goods, and the U.S. export to China actually, in terms of goods, is much less. So there's really not much that China can retaliate. But I think that it's also not very well thought out, not surprisingly. But you know, among the major Chinese exports to the U.S. is the Apple iPhone. Okay, Apple iPhone is probably about 1/5 of Chinese exports to the U.S. by value. Okay, and if you think about putting in tariffs on Apple iPhones coming to the United States of 25%, it's not going to hurt China. Okay, it's going to hurt Apple very much. It would make all the iPhone users in the U.S. very mad, right? So, I'm still not sure it would happen. But even if it happens, I mean, China would not be hurt very much by this. But more seriously, I actually did some calculations, and one of the things that one should realize is the following: is that the value added of Chinese exports to the U.S. is very low. We all understand what value is. What is added in China domestically? Take an iPhone. iPhone value added is around 3 to 5%, because everything else is shipped in from the outside. All right, and the intellectual property would be owned by Apple and so forth. So, but the average value added of Chinese exports to the U.S. is about a quarter, about 25%. Now, total Chinese exports as a percentage of goods to the U.S. as a percent of Chinese GDP is actually very low. Very few people know this, but it's only 3.4%. 3.4%. Now, if you multiply 3.4% by 25%, you get something much less than 1%. This is going to be the loss in GDP in China. Okay, it's not. You don't want to lose it, frankly. But on the other hand, China can afford to lose it. Okay, it's really can be. I mean, for a country growing at 6.5%, well, okay, right? It's not a major deal. But it's even less for the U.S. I mean, you know, U.S. exports much less to China, has a much bigger GDP. The impact on the U.S. is actually, on the whole, not that big either. So I think that it's not going to be settled very quickly. But the more I want to say is that the major motivation is actually political. So I don't think anything is going to be settled before the midterm election in the U.S., at least not until then, okay? Because bashing China can be a very popular political campaign slogan, and I think President Trump would take advantage of it no matter what happens. So I don't actually expect a solution certainly not before the midterm elections. There are other grievances, some of them quite justified: intellectual property protection, forced technology transfer, cyber thefts, and so forth. But I want to say one thing, that is, if you really look into it, intellectual property right protection in China has improved enormously in the last 5 years. And China has set up special courts for the sole purpose of adjudicating intellectual property rights review. And they actually have begun to find economic meaningful fines imposed on violators. I think it used to be they would just fine a violator 1,000 yuan, which is nothing, right? People keep doing it. But I think they have begun to fine $1.5 million US and so forth. So I think it's having some impact. Now, but the most important thing to realize is that China now grants more patents, than any other country in the world, than the U.S. So China, there's a constituency in China wanting to protect their patents. Okay, so I think that is really what's going to happen. The forced technology transfer is basically, I think, a moot issue because China no longer requires a joint venture partnership. Tesla has a wholly owned subsidiary, and General Motors basically said, yes, we know we can buy our partner off, but we don't want to buy our partner. All right, so I think that's no longer an issue. Cyber thefts, I think, is something that both sides work together. It is a crime, either side, and really should be rigorously enforced, okay, on commercial cyber theft. Spycraft, I can't do anything about. I think that's from time immemorial. Countries spy against one another. We can't do anything about it. Okay, now, but the other one, but more fundamentally, I want to say one thing. That is the competition, both economic and technological, is going to be ongoing. I mean, it's not because of President Trump. Because if you think about it, the pivot to Asia, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, these were started Obama initiatives, all right? So even if you have different president, I think the same underlying tension will be there. And there will be competition. We hope it could be competition that is fair, that is friendly, and would not really lead us onto a road to war. I'm optimistic. I think that with all of us working together on both sides of the Pacific, I think we can actually make the China-U.S. partnership a very successful one. Thank you very much.
All right. Now we're going to turn to Susan Shirk, and I think Susan will be addressing some of the technological development issues. Susan.
Right. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to join this wonderful Stanford gathering. I'm just down the road a piece at UC San Diego.
And she comes up a lot to Stanford.
I come up a lot, and I'm really pleased that Li Hongbin and Jinoi invited me to come and join you. But I hope that I'm not going to come out sounding like the bad fairy at this party. But I do feel, I've always felt, in all the many years I've worked on China and U.S. China relations, that I speak frankly and say the same thing to everyone. I like to think of myself as a zhengyo, a frank friend of China. Obviously, the Trump tariffs are completely wrong-headed. It makes no sense at all. It's not addressing, actually, a lot of the much deeper problems in the U.S.-China economic relationship. It's impossible for folks in the United States or in China to figure out what is the objective of these punitive tariffs. It doesn't appear that President Trump is really very interested in negotiating. It's very frustrating to people like me who served in government, because I really feel that it's a moment in time when the US and China could make real progress in negotiating the nature of our economic interdependence. But the US side, first of all, we can't even figure out with whom China would negotiate. And there just doesn't seem to be much interest in negotiating. I agree with Larry Lau that as we try to figure out what they're all about, it looks like the primary objective is electoral politics. And I know I did have the opportunity about 6 months ago in my work on the task force on US policy toward China to meet with Steve Bannon when he was just leaving the Trump administration. It was very illuminating. He really believes that criticizing China, knocking China, was the magic that brought Trump an electoral victory. And that going to red states and talking about how China's taking advantage of the United States really stirred up the crowds and attracted votes. And I think Donald Trump believes that too. And So even though it's irrational from the standpoint of U.S. national interests, I think he believes that, you know, it's a good thing to do. But what I do want to talk about today is not the tariffs and all of the mistakes that our misguided president is making, but something that goes beyond Trump, beyond this administration, to broader reaction to China from Congress, from the U.S. business community, and even in Europe, Australia, Japan. There is a big backlash against China's high-tech industrial policy and the way it's being pursued in the context of a number of other trends in China's domestic politics and economics. And I just want to explain this, especially to my Chinese friends here. And I'm really worried about this because this backlash could really destroy the production chains, which I believe that increasingly I think of these global production chains as, I'm not a Marxist, but I think of them kind of as the economic base of the global peace that we have enjoyed over the past decades. And if we try to disentangle them and disentangle the relationship between US and China, the economic and tech relationship, that'll destroy the global production chains that have been the base of peaceful interdependence and will certainly intensify geopolitical hostilities between US and China. So at the 21st Century China Center that I chair at UC San Diego, we have a group of economists and political scientists who've been studying China's industrial policy and technological innovation, including its outbound investment. And back in the winter, we had a workshop in Washington where we had to try to think out, okay, forget Trump administration mistakes. What should we be doing? What is the right policy to take to reviewing and regulating Chinese tech investment in the United States? So we had the head of CFIUS, Ayman Mir. We had the regulator from the EU. We had the Japanese regulator. We had the Canadian regulator, as well as France and Germany. And what was striking to me is that in all of these places, they're tightening up the review of Chinese tech investment, tightening up the scrutiny. So what underlies this? What is the concern? Why is everyone so worried about China's high-tech industrial policy in AI, robotics, quantum computing, and other high-tech industries? I guess one of the main points I want to make to you, I know there are many folks in China who say, well, you know, every country has industrial policy, now it's China's turn. But most of the analysis from outside China has concluded that this is not your normal industrial policy. And some of it is just scale, that China is so large and is putting, you know, $1 trillion in guidance funds for investment in technology. But some of it also is the role of the state. Now, of course, the drive to acquire foreign technology has been going on for quite a long time. Started back in the 1970s, just as early as when China first opened up. But what is very new is that the role of the state is, and the fact that this transcends so many different industrial sectors, the state role is so dominant. The funding is going to private firms and picking favored private firms as well as state-owned enterprises. So you can't draw some clear line between the state sector and the non-state sector. And just the fact that it's being pursued by outbound investment. I mean, China is the first non-OECD country to become a major foreign investor this way. And what we see is it started out with energy and raw materials, and now by 2016, the largest share of that outbound investment is in technology, high tech. And of course, outbound investment declined as a result of capital controls and growing restrictiveness in other countries. But those capital controls very clearly and explicitly excluded high-tech investment, which made the state driver of the effort, made it look like this is China Incorporated, led by Beijing, much more than it had previously. So another important, so this is, I guess what I'm trying to say here and help people understand is that this is really increasingly viewed as a threat to a national security threat and a threat to the economic competitiveness of other advanced industrial countries. China's explicit goals of its targets of the extent to which it wants to control the production of high-tech industries is viewed as a threat to the firms in other countries where they occupy some of the highest value-added part of these production chains. So it's also true that when it comes to China's own market is no longer open as much as it once was to the foreign firms that want to do business here, and there's no true national treatment in these industrial policies, so that international firms feel that the game is rigged against them inside China, and then this big effort to go outside of China and acquire technology is also a threat to them. Until a decade or so ago, China was also pursuing market reform much more actively and explicitly. So there was a sense that China's system and Western systems were, to a certain extent, converging with one another. But nowadays, under the Xi Jinping administration, it's not going that way. It's not converging. The role of the state in the economy has increased. And we also, on the political system, we have a system that is centralizing power in the hands of the General Secretary of the Communist Party, emphasizing socialist ideology, return to Marxism, Marxist education in universities and secondary schools in China. The 19th Party Congress documents proclaiming that socialism with Chinese characteristics is a model for other countries in the world was such a shift from the restraint that China had shown in the past in emphasizing system differences. So these political factors also definitely increase the sense of a China threat. And finally, the fact that the effort to turn China into a high-tech superpower is also very explicitly designed to improve China's military capabilities. The whole civil-military integration policy has been followed very closely by the Pentagon and other people in Japan and other places, and they see this as turning China into a more formidable military threat than it had been previously. So I'm really worried about the reaction in the United States to this newly perceived threat, and that we are overreacting in ways that will be highly detrimental to American economy and society. You know, people say about Congress, it does two things well: do nothing and overreact. I think we're seeing both of them right now. So I have some ideas about how the U.S. should be reacting, and because I am really concerned that overreactions could lead to something resembling Cold War II, and a kind of Red Scare attitude. It could lead us to start excluding Chinese students from our universities in certain fields, which will be very bad, not just for the universities, but for the U.S. economy. I certainly agree with Eric Schmidt that we should be encouraging students from all over the world, including China, to come and study in America and to stay in America. I also feel that a lot of our overreactions now in our new legislation, reviewing Chinese investment and export controls and other things that you're going to be seeing getting rolled out in the next 12 months or so, are really going to harm the vibrancy of our own innovative ecosystem. So I have some ideas about how we could do it better, and maybe we can turn to those in the discussion section. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Those are actually very complimentary presentations. Because I think part of the problem is that China has changed so much since it began opening and reform. And I think at that point, the relationship between China and the US was very unequal. It was clearly the developing country, and now China has sort of spurted, ahead. And as Eric Schmidt was saying, that in fact it is now perhaps an equal, not just, it's not a near equal. So given this, you both have sort of pointed out sort of what the problem is, and the problem in many ways, political. And Larry was pointing out that it's not so much the economic, it's the political. But, so Larry, let me first turn to you. You say that they need to treat each other as equals. But given that the problem is political, how is that actually going to happen given the domestic politics in each country? And as you were saying, that bashing China is what got Trump elected. Oh, actually, Susan was saying this. But then there's the question of why then, because many other candidates, when they were on the trail, would bash China, but once they came into office, they would change. But Trump has not done that. So this is a...
I think one of the things that you should realize is the following. In 2000, Chinese GDP is only 20% of the US's. Today is 2/3, and it's really increasing very fast. I mean, that's 20 years. So, so I think what is going to happen is that China would want to claim its rightful place. It doesn't want to displace the U.S., but it's quite happy to play number 2. but I think that it would have to advance, and I think that if you actually look back, basically every country has to develop its own science and technology eventually, right? Soviet Union developed its own bomb without our help. China developed its bomb without the help of either the Soviet Union nor the United States. So I think every country, large country, will eventually have to be self-reliant. I think that is true of technology, and I think that I cannot dream of a case in which the U.S. will sell weapons to China. I really cannot.
We were talking about doing it.
I cannot think of a conceivable scenario.
Under Reagan, we were contemplating.
That's a long time ago. At the time, China is here, and the U.S. is here. You can sell anything. So my view is that but for both countries to accept someone else as an equal, that's what I try to say.
Right.
It's an equal. It's actually not so easy. They both have to learn to accept that the other is an equal. Okay. I mean, historically, China has never considered anyone as an equal. Either China is up here or China is down here, right? The U.S., every other country except the Soviet Union, is considered below the U.S. Right?
So this means that you're actually quite pessimistic that within China, particularly with Trump threatening more tariffs, that because of nationalist reasons, that the Xi Jinping and others are just going to.
Well, I think the tariffs are actually not so important. Okay, because the amount of trade affected.
No, I know that in the amount, but in terms of symbolically, politically.
True. But I think it won't have much real effect. Much real effect.
Well, the Chinese, may I jump in here?
Please.
Given how difficult it has been to figure out what the objective of the Trump actions is, the Chinese side now, I believe, has officially concluded and told everyone that this is containment. This is basically a hostile effort to keep China weak. And I think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw, because otherwise it's so difficult to figure out how the United States is pursuing more specific objectives in China of getting modification of the way of Chinese policies. So I'm sure that most people in China are kind of rallying around the flag and supporting President Xi and saying that China is being unfairly attacked by the United States.
Let me turn back to a point, because you were highlighting all of the role of the state. And in our lunch talk by Eric Schmidt, in some ways, he was sort of talking about the positives of that.
Oh.
So it's like your reaction.
Yeah, it sounded, I have to say, I was really happy to hear the way he concluded and said that both approaches can be successful, the more market-oriented approach and the more state-led industrial policy. But a lot of what he said, I don't know if he's still here or not, but did say, this is why it's so good to be old, to be a dinosaur, because you remember the first round when the United States felt that it was going to be surpassed by Japan.
Yes.
And at the time, we thought, oh, gee, our system has failed. Japan has this government-led industrial policy, and it's working better than our system, so we should become more like Japan. And then in the end, the U.S. open market economy and flexible supply chains across the Pacific actually resulted in a very vibrant recovery. And meanwhile, Japan went into the doldrums. So a lot of what he was saying about state-led efforts and how successful they can be reminded me of that. And I don't think that the United States should do that. I think the United States should definitely treat it as a Sputnik moment. We should definitely put more money into R&D. You know, that's really declined. But we should just make ourselves a better version of ourselves instead of trying to model ourselves on the more state-driven approach of China.
Let me turn to a slightly different aspect of this, because you were talking about, you used the term overreacting. And I'd like to, both to Larry and you, for example, the policy Made in China 2025 has gotten a lot of press in the US. But, and here it goes back to the point that you were making, that China is becoming more and more centralized, going back, in some ways, back to the future. And I know that one of your colleagues, Barry Naughton, uses this term grand steerage to refer to all this government-directed investment in this Made in 2025 and, you know, the BRI and such. But as two people who really understand China, we also have many experiences and knowledge of what happens to centralized government plans. And I actually, this has not been discussed here, but the question of how successful do you think this policy of Made in China 2025 is? In other words, do they actually have all of the parts to be as innovative as China needs to be to fulfill the goals that the leadership laid out in the 19th Party Congress and in the most recent National NPC? I mean, it's a really ambitious goal that they've laid out for the next, 25 and 50 years. Because some people, have said that while, and you mentioned this idea about patents, but there's a difference between the number of patents and the number of how they then whether they turn the patents into products. And so people are saying that this I think it's called the innovation chain is missing key links. I'm curious what you think about this.
Well, I think there are a lot of people in this room who have their own views and information about and experience about how the system actually works. And I don't know. I think it's really too early to say, and I don't think the overreaction is based on the premise that it's necessarily all working perfectly. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of waste involved, and there are a lot of mistakes. I mean, is it really such a great idea to have a national team in different fields who are favored to that extent? What happens to the smaller and medium-sized competitors? I don't know. So it's very hard to say how well it works. I'd like to hear what folks in the audience think.
Actually, I think first place is that I think things have really opened up, partly because of U.S. pressure competition. We know that, for example, automobile companies can be wholly owned. It used to be, it has to be 50-50, joint venture. Tesla is allowed to have that. And I think everybody can now have a wholly owned automobile company manufacturing in China, okay, today. All right, I mean, that rule has been changed. And I think it's a good change, I mean, to have that rule. I think so I think things are really evolving, right? But I think that the other thing, though, is that there's actually, tell you the truth, over competition in one sense. You know, China is actually still very much behind on semiconductor manufacturing, okay? Which is a fact, right? And that's why when the ZTE got in trouble, you know, it can't buy any chips anymore. It's basically finished because it buys all its chips from Intel.
But doesn't that just give an incentive for China to more quickly develop its
No, but there's a difference between Huawei actually doesn't buy from Intel. Huawei designs its own chips. So basically, it all depends on different companies, you know, that has, you know, reacted differently. But what I really want to say is that that it really depends on how things work out. But take something like semiconductor. Now, after this this ZTE episode, right, I think China wants to support domestic manufacturing of chips. But what has happened is that there are now maybe 10 to 20 firms all trying to get into the manufacturing of chips. There aren't that many people. There aren't that many engineers. So if you actually have 20 firms trying to do it, it won't be successful. All you need is about 2, 3, maybe 4 firms doing it. So it's a very different set of problems that the government basically, you know, how you push makes a difference.
Well, let's should we open it up for some questions?
Okay, I guess I just want to make one point that is stimulated by the, I think, very wrong decision that the U.S. made about ZTE. Is that, and then it just motivated Chinese leadership, Chinese people to feel like it has to be self-reliant in chips. But, you know, I think the areas in which a country has to be self-reliant should be as few as possible, because the integration, the interdependence is really a positive thing. And if one country feels that another country is going to exclude it or have an embargo on it, which is basically what the US did. It said, we're going to embargo our technology so ZTE can't buy it. And then, of course, that motivates the Chinese side to feel like we don't want to be vulnerable to an embargo. So all of these exclusionary moves then encourage the other side to feel that they have to build up their own capacity, and then it, you know, creates these hostile suspicions in which each side is trying to hedge against the risk of being excluded by the other side. So that's a terrible future for US and China. It won't just be bad for US and China. The whole era of globalization that we've experienced, this peaceful globalization, could really end if the US and China start trying to exclude one another and reacting. You get this, you know, tit for tat kind of hostile interactions between the two sides.
Let me just ask one more question, and I think hopefully this will end on a more positive note. So in spite of these President Trump's policies and such, and particularly what you were saying, Larry, in the end, does this mean that we can keep continuing going on, the interaction, the businesses, the academic exchanges, to continue to try to engage and have entanglement?
You know, as I was saying, this rivalry, and we hope it's a friendly rivalry between U.S. and China, is probably inevitable, because even under Obama, you know, he had you know, the TPP, and then he had these other things which are basically slightly directed against, you know, against China. China's not part of it. But anyway, but I agree with you that maybe things can be better if they were more open. Right. More open.
Right, right.
Should we open it up?
Yes, I don't know the organizers are going to allow us. There's a break right now, so I'm just going to use this, my prerogative as a chair, and say we're going to open up for a couple of questions, even though it says time up. So questions, we'll just take one or two. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Shirk and Professor Oy. So I was a Stanford student, and then I worked at USTR about 10 years ago.
I can't hear you very well.
I worked at USTR 10 years ago in the China office, and even back then we were talking about Chinese industrial policy. All this conversation about how the industrial policy is not the right thing or whatever it is, all that talk, do you believe it moves in the right direction? Do you believe it results in action?
On the Chinese side?
Yeah.
Well, I think obviously it makes no sense at all to say to China, okay, forget it, don't even, tear up Made in China 2025. That's ridiculous. But what we can do is to have a set of very specific asks of ways in which we would like to see those policies be modified so that foreign firms have the kind of market access in China that they would like to have. So, more national treatment for the subsidies and benefits of that industrial policy should be available to all firms in China, regardless of who owns them. Also, more transparency about the specific funding and subsidies for different countries, different companies. There are a number of aspects of industrial policy that we could negotiate. And I think actually the Chinese side might be quite amenable to negotiating some of those things in order to, China's leaders are, I believe, well aware that this is a backlash that goes beyond the United States, beyond Trump. It's Germany, it's Europe, it's Japan, everywhere, in all the advanced industrial countries in the world. So I think that there are some specific modifications that could be negotiated.
Yes, Larry?
One thing. I actually want to add one thing. I don't disagree with Susan, but I think you really have to remember that China today, at this level of development, actually is much more open than Japan ever was. Just think of foreign investment in Japan. Really much, much more open than Japan or Korea than they ever were. So, I'm not saying that what you said is wrong, but I'm saying that you really have to look at the relatives.
One more question? Question?
Wow, everybody wants to break.
Oh, there's one hand over there.
Thank you for the very illuminating talks. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. One of the challenges that many of our corporate clients and CEOs on both sides of the Pacific face today is that there's no framework, or there's no structure around which this issue is being negotiated, right? Or this issue is being structured. WTO is no longer a forum. The bilateral talks have stopped. Are we moving into an era in which there's no longer a framework for this discussion? There's no longer rules. There's just episodic actions, episodic policies. As one example, for instance, the new CFIUS 2 that's being, soon will be put into law, basically it says we can do whatever we want, whenever we want, and any type of deal according to our own rules. And that's just one example of many where people are saying, are there any rules going forward? Are there any frameworks? Or is it just the whim of the day of the policymakers who are in power at the moment?
Well, actually, the U.S., even this new FIRMA bill, is at least based on national security. compared to other countries, that it's much broader. And what we don't have yet are the regulations. You know, we just have the legislation, but now there are going to be a whole lot of regulations. That's really going to be the important action now. What are the sectors that are considered core technologies critical to national security? I'm in favor of having a very restrictive definition of what are the core technologies relevant to national security. What Defense Secretary Robert Gates said when talking about export controls, we need a small, what do you call it, small farm or small and high fence, small ranch and high fence. So very limited number of technologies. So we are going to have some rules. But of course the problem is that investment, technology, all these areas are not really covered by WTO. And you know, what would be great is if China, in an effort to kind of rebuild its reputation as a country truly committed to an open global economic order, would take some initiatives at the WTO or associated with the WTO to let's start talking about what the rules should be.
Right. Well, I think, Larry, wait, last word.
Not quite the last word, but what I want to say is that I think China is also committed to a rule-based world, and I think it really takes. I would say this, that China, Europe, and the rest of the world will probably still committed to the WTO rules, and I think U.S. is an aberration right now.
But the WTO rules don't cover a lot of the most difficult
I know,
issues.
but that you would need new negotiations.
Right.
Yeah, but I would just say on goods, that these other countries are still committed to WTO rules.
Well, clearly this is a topic that's very complex, and there will be many challenges before I think this is resolved. But I think that in the meantime, I think that with the continuation of this type of exchange, of sending of China's best and brightest coming to Stanford, and American students also coming here, I think will certainly improve this. So with that, thank you very much.